Good evening. I'm Alan Matiso, Associate Director of the Baker Institute, and I'm pleased to welcome everybody to tonight's event. In 1995, the Arab American Educational Foundation, which is a foundation here in the city, created an endowment at Rice University for Arab studies. And after a 2-year search, the university appointed as the first holder of that chair our speaker tonight, Ussama Makdisi, who at that time was a newly minted Princeton Ph.D. Since then, he's had a very distinguished Rice career. 3 years after he got his Ph.D., he published his first book, which was called The Culture of Sectarianism, Community, History, and Violence in 19th Century Ottoman Lebanon. This was a remarkable first book, and it got very enthusiastic reviews from the journals. It's a work of passion, it's a deeply researched work, and it argues a very subtle and important thesis. American policymakers, the American public may think that sectarian conflict has roots that go back to the ancient world, but he argues that, in fact, sectarianism is a product of modernity. He focuses on Lebanon in 1840 to 1860, and he shows in that case how modern forces created this modern phenomenon. Since then, he fulfilled the promise of that first book and has become one of the leading scholars in the field of Arab history. And one reason why we know that is all the awards that have honored him. He has, for example, been a resident scholar in Turkey, Beirut, Berlin, Paris, and Harvard. He's received grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. He's been a Carnegie Scholar. He publishes in the leading journals, including the American Historical Review and the Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. And all that time, as he was building up his career, he was here at Rice as a teacher. And there is one award that he got that I would mention in particular, which was his award in 2008 for superior teaching, the George R. Brown Award for Superior Teaching, which is voted by students. And I would like to emphasize that because I think it's a special award. What Ussama teaches is highly controversial. In fact, it's inflammatory. And the students who voted him this award were not only honoring him for his learning, but for his tact in negotiating a very difficult subject. He was, of course, writing more books. Artillery of Heaven, American Missionaries and the Failed Conquest of the Middle East, 2008. Faith Misplaced, The Broken Promise of U.S.-Arab Relations, 1820 to 2001. Public policy institutes like this one bring to the podium people who make policy, people who defend policy, and critics of policy. Ussama is a critic. He is a scholar of the modern Arab world, including post-World War II era when the United States replaced Great Britain as the great power in the region. He believes that the Americans made very serious mistakes in the conduct of their policy in that region, not least of which is their assumption of American benevolence. So he is not a scholar who comforts or entertains. He's a scholar who challenges. And I expect that that will be the case tonight. His subject is the book he's working on, not yet published, called The Ecumenical Frame, Coexistence and Sectarianism in the Modern Middle East. What this means is, I believe, that he will try out ideas he's still working on. and he's going to try them out on you. So pay attention and tell him what you think. So I would like to welcome to the podium tonight my friend and colleague of 20 years, Ussama Makdisi.
Thank you so much, Alan, Professor Matiso, and I am going to challenge you and hopefully not bore you. Alan is telling me, ditch the talk, just speak. I could do that, but let me start, Let me start with a bit of reading, and then we'll see where we go. How do I get this? All right, there's some... Alan said I'm going to challenge you. So your first task is to learn a few Arabic words and a few Ottoman words, which I'll come to in the talk. Hopefully, it'll make sense by the end of my lecture. Of course, I'd like to thank Alan for that generous introduction. I'd like to thank Ambassador Jurigian. I'd like to thank the Baker Institute and the staff for hosting me here this evening, as I do talk a little bit about my new book, or at least the manuscript of my new book, which is about coexistence, a history of coexistence in the modern Middle East. And the book begins with a sentence, which is that there is no history of sectarianism that's not also a history of pluralism. Or to put it in the positive terms, every history of sectarianism is also a history of pluralism. And the reason I say that is because the history of the Middle East and the history of the Middle East in the 18th and 19th centuries and into the 20th century, in fact, all the way until today, is a history of extraordinary beauty and pluralism and diversity, and also a history and a region rife with extraordinary challenges. And as Alan said, not I, empire and imperialism, but I'll say it too, empire and imperialism and all sorts of challenges. And so the term sectarianism that you have all heard, and we've all heard, we've been exposed to with an extraordinary degree after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, remains, as far as I can tell, one of the most overused and least historicized, theorized concepts when we think about the Middle East. So think about the term sectarianism and how it's used in typical journalistic fashion or even in many academic works. The term sectarianism can mean any number of things. It can mean pervasive forms of prejudice. It can mean the identification with a religious or ethnic community as if that community were a political party. It can also mean, and is used to mean, the mobilization of various communities or individuals belonging to particular communities, whether Sunni or Shia, Christian or Jewish, through which political, economic, and social claims are made in multi-religious and multi-confessional societies or states or polities. The term sectarianism is also used, to add to the confusion, to denote outright communal mobilizations and massacres. For example, what is happening or what's been happening in Iraq since 2003, what's happening in Syria, what happened in India in the Gujarat genocide or massacres in 2001. But no matter what the term sectarianism actually denotes, the description of sectarianism, when it comes to the Middle East and when it comes to the modern contemporary Middle East, invariably assumes one thing, and that is that sectarianism corresponds, this is at least what we are told and what we are essentially bombarded with, that sectarianism denotes or comports or equates very simply with the reality of the Middle East of religious diversity. It's as if being a religiously diverse region means being a sectarian region. It's as if you just add geopolitics and the Middle East will explode. It's as if the people in the Middle East are always on the edge of a sectarian volcano. That, at least, is the common assumption with which I see how the Middle East is being reported. Now, understanding geopolitics is, of course, crucial. It's crucial to understanding why it is that a country like Syria today is unraveling, why it is that Iraq has unraveled. But to my mind, sectarianism is not simply, and has never simply been, the practice of discrimination or outright violence or a contest over resources in a multi-religious society. It has also been, from its inception as a word in political Arabic in the 20th century, it's also been a term, a judgment, a discourse, a deliberate invocation of an idea to label other people, other groups, other individuals. Because as far as I can tell, no group in the world has ever described itself as, in the Middle East at least, as overtly sectarian. Nobody parades or says, I am sectarian. People are always labeled as sectarian. Modern empires and modern nation states, including virtually the United States and all the states in the region in the Middle East, and their ideologues and camp followers describe others as sectarian to justify policies, to justify the failure of policies, and to suggest the violent, irrational, and tribal antithesis of their civilization and their nationalism, an antithesis that has to be suppressed, managed, or maintained. So let me go back to what the former President Barack Obama said in April 2016 in an interview in The Atlantic magazine when he expressed his frank disappointment with the Middle East. He said, and I'm quoting, "You've got countries that have very few civic traditions, so that as autocratic regimes start fraying, the only organizing principles are sectarian," end quote. Now, this description of the Middle East by the then President Obama is not only patently absurd, it's also extraordinarily misleading. It's also highly ideological. What the then President Obama said, and what countless American commentators today still tell us about the Middle East, reflects, I think, far less about the objective history or reality of the Middle East than about their assumptions and their stereotypes about this region. Think indeed for a moment, challenge yourselves. Think indeed of how today we use the words Arab and Jew as oppositional categories, without ever wondering or thinking why it is that the term Arab, which could and should, in its most ideal form, encompass Muslim, Christian, and Jew, why it is that today it has become oppositional to the word Jew. Why is it? What happened? When did this happen? Think about how in our own era, especially after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, that we started to refer to Saddam Hussein as, quote, a Sunni dictator. Although he belonged to a party, nominally at least, certainly by the end of his life, nominally, by the end of his life, he belonged to a party that began decades before as a secular pan-Arab party whose founders in Syria were Muslim and Christian, and in fact included Alawis as well. Think most of all about how Western journalism and scholarship about the Middle East and pundits who talk about the Middle East routinely identify individuals in the Middle East, almost without fail, as belonging to this or that community, so that people are always referred to as Sunni or Shi'i, as Christian or as Muslim, no matter what they themselves say. It doesn't matter if they call themselves secular, they're always being portrayed or represented as belonging to this or that community, which is the equivalent of referring to Americans as white or black or Latino every time you refer to them, no matter how they themselves identify themselves. It's not to say, of course, that there aren't significant, pertinent racial identities in this country, or ethnic identities, or sectarian identities in the Middle East. Of course there are. But people are often referred to and put in these boxes from which they can't, in a sense, escape. So if there's anything I'd like you to remember when we get to the Q&A, it's that I do not believe in sectarianism with a capital S. There is no such thing as sectarianism that floats above history. There's no such thing that we should think of in the medieval world that's the same as what's happening today. Today's events, today's contexts are completely different. Like the pernicious concept of race and the idea of races, sects do not simply exist. They are manufactured, and they are produced over and over again every single day. It takes a huge amount of work to mobilize people. It doesn't just happen naturally. The US historian Barbara Fields has described the production of racecraft in this country, and we might well think of sectcraft along the same lines. That is to say, prejudice and religious identities alone do not make sectarianism. Politics, mobilization, historical and sociological context do. And above all, interpretation does. To be clear, again, I don't deny, and nobody who works in the Middle East can deny that sectarian mobilizations are occurring. Nobody can deny that sectarian affiliations in the Middle East are meaningful in particular contexts. But insofar as we can discern a communal or caste problem in India, a racial problem in this country and in Europe, then obviously we can also discern a sectarian problem in the Middle East. I do disagree, however, very strongly with narratives, as I've suggested, that assume that sectarianism is either inevitable or that it reflects an atavistic, a primordial, an age-old condition on the part of people in the Middle East. There's a huge difference between saying people take religion seriously and religion means something and sectarian identities mean something in the Middle East, and actually explaining what is happening today in Syria and Iraq. In other words, what happens between identity and violence is the whole range of history that our job and your job is to interpret rationally and humanistically. Where then should I begin the story of sectarianism and its twin, pluralism or coexistence, in the Middle East? Well, I would begin in the 19th century. And the reason why I begin in the 19th century is because, first of all, it's clear to me that when we think about sectarianism in the Middle East today, we're talking about modern contexts, modern nation states, and contests and mobilizations that involve almost always outside powers as well as internal actors. So there's no point talking about medieval history, because what's happening today has almost nothing to do with the medieval period and almost everything to do with our contemporary modern context. And there are three reasons why I say the 19th century. First, because the region of what we today call the Middle East, the Arab world, was in the 19th century, and in fact, from 1516 and 1517, part of the Ottoman Empire, a massive, long-standing, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilinguistic imperial system that ruled over the Arab world, as I said, from 1516, 1517, all the way until the First World War. And when this empire began to collapse or began to weaken substantially in the 19th century, it opened up all sorts of possibilities for reimagining what was to become of this world. The point also I want to make is that the sectarian questions that we think of today, Muslim versus Christian, Arab versus Jew, and today most obviously Sunni versus Shia, are all products, or in a sense all emerge out of the end of the Ottoman Empire and the post-Ottoman world. The first major urban massacres that took place against Christians in the Arab provinces occurred in the middle of the 19th century. The most infamous massacre of Christians in Damascus took place in 1860. It didn't happen in 1760, nor in 1660, nor in 1560. It happened in 1860 for reasons that I can get into later. In other words, there were economic, political, cultural, and social conditions that led to a specific mid-19th century sectarian crisis. And to begin to think about a sectarian crisis in the 19th century as today means to ask these kinds of questions. Who's involved? What are the social conditions? What are the economic conditions? What are the cultural conditions? And above all, what are the political conditions? What is the role of the Ottoman state? What is the role of foreign, especially European powers that began to intervene in this part of the world in the 19th century in an extraordinarily aggressive fashion? So the issue for me is not Islam or Christianity. It's not the Quran or the Bible. Leave those aside for the moment. It's all about, in a sense, history and context and geopolitics. The second reason why I begin in the 19th century is that when we think about sectarianism and coexistence, we're thinking almost always about a problem of equality. And when we think about a problem of equality and secular equality, we're talking about a modern condition of states. And so the problems of sectarianism are related to the problems of nationalism, to the problems of citizenship, and to the problem of political equality, irrespective of religious affiliation, which is a problem that almost every major power and state in the 19th century, and in fact in the 20th century, and even as we see in the US today, in the 21st century, every major state deals with and grapples with. My point is that many states in the 19th century grappled with new ideas of secular citizenship and equality and struggled to reconcile these ideas of secular equality, which is an extraordinarily noble idea. How do you reconcile that with a history of long-standing religious or racial difference, discrimination, and oppression. To put the point in maybe the simplest and crudest terms, at the same time as the United States struggled with slavery and the question of black emancipation, and Europe struggled with the question of the Jewish question and the emancipation of Jews in Europe, the Ottoman Empire was confronted with its own question of what is the place of non-Muslims in what had always been an Islamic empire, the Ottoman Muslim Empire. The US, after all, for those who think that the sectarianism is a Middle Eastern condition, just consider the fact that the US witnessed and endured a civil war and countless bouts of race rioting before, after, and during the time that the Ottoman Empire witnessed, as I said, let's say, a sectarian crisis manifested in the mid-19th century, which was all about what is the place of non-Muslims in an Islamic state. My point, of course, is not to pretend that non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire occupied the same place that African Americans occupied in the United States. There's no question. Blacks in this country were oppressed and were under slavery, and that is no comparison to the conditions of non-Muslims in the Ottoman Empire. There were no ghettos, really, as far as I'm aware, in the Ottoman Empire. There's no question that blacks were fundamentally more oppressed. Rather, my point is to suggest that what race has been to America, religion has been to the Middle East, perceived as stable and obvious categories, but whose political implications, in fact, have changed radically over and across the 19th and 20th centuries. So in other words, if in America, as we all know, race or the question of race has defined, undergirded, contradicted, and rendered ambivalent the meaning of US citizenship, it goes to the very heart, and we see this again playing out today, of what it means to be an American. In the Ottoman Middle East and in the post-Ottoman Middle East, in fact until today, the question of religious difference has haunted an incomplete, paradoxical, and often contradictory 19th century project of equal citizenship. The difference, however, between the Arab world or the Ottoman Empire and the West is that the Arabs have hardly affected, intervened, and transformed the nature of modern Europe or the United States to the same degree that Europeans and Americans have transformed and still transform, obviously, the Arab world. So this brings me to my third point. So the point number one is why the 19th century is the Ottoman context. Point number two, it's a global question and problem where everyone is trying to figure out how do you reconcile equality with difference. And point number three, just as important, the question of foreign intervention and imperialism. Because beginning in the 19th century, Western imperial powers, this is before the British and the French, before the Americans, it's the British and the French, as Alan pointed out. This is when British and French and Russian and Austrian powers began to intervene massively in the history and in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire. And of course, the most famous of these is Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence. There is simply no way to understand anything that happens in the Middle East without acknowledging at the outset, frankly, how Western powers emerged or went from being factors, players, and agents in what remained a sovereign Ottoman Empire to being the powers that shaped the post-Ottoman Middle East. So they go from being factors to being the architects of of what we today call the Arab world. And so there is a brute reality of Western involvement in the Middle East that I don't think for a moment can be denied or obscured or rendered secondary to what the late Fuad Ajami tendentiously referred to as, quote, the self-inflicted wounds that he said matter more. There's no such thing as a self-inflicted wound. There are self-inflicted wounds that work always in tandem with Western power. They go together, they create each other. There's a dialectic. Remember that in the map of the modern world of today, Lebanon, where is this map? See if I can, that's the Ottoman Empire. Lebanon, the state of Lebanon was created by the French in 1920. Syria was also created by the French in 1920, and it was in fact divided. Israel, Palestine, the Mandate of Palestine, these are the mandates, by the way. The Mandate of Palestine, which becomes the state of Israel, again, was impossible without British intervention. Iraq was creation of the British, and so on and so forth. There is no way to understand any of this without understanding this history. Does that mean that the West is to blame for everything? No, of course not. But does it mean that the West is implicated in virtually every major shift in the region, beginning in the 19th century? And the answer is yes. There is no history, in other words, of the modern Middle East that's not also a history of British, French, and today American intervention and imperialism as well. Now, as far as the question of sectarianism goes and coexistence, what I'd like to talk about now briefly is how European interventions in the 19th century helped shape the first sectarian polity. So today everyone knows about Lebanon, that Lebanon in the country, they divide formal government between Muslims and Christians so that a Maronite Christian is the president, a Sunni Muslim is the prime minister, a Shia Muslim is a speaker of parliament, and that's the same model that the US took to Iraq after the invasion of Iraq in 2003, where the US, essentially, not necessarily legally, but essentially divided Iraq into, quote, Sunni, Shia, and Kurd. And so the same idea, the sectarian sort of method. The first and most important of these systems that was set up in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire was set up in what is today Lebanon, at the time Mount Lebanon, in 1861, following a massacre that took place of Christians in Damascus in 1860 and in Mount Lebanon in June of 1860 and in July of 1860. Now, as I said, I'm not going to give you a long history about the massacres, why they occurred, what happened. Suffice it to say that there were all sorts of reasons, including European intervention, including local interpretations of Ottoman reform, including Ottoman government. And there was all these reasons that led to the massacre of Christians, because this was a moment, again, as I said, where the empire was shifting from being an empire of Muslims over non-Muslims to being an empire where all Ottomans were ostensibly equal subjects. And this was a very difficult transition. And there was a moment in 1860 where Christians were massacred in this exceptional episodic time, 1860, July 1860, this major massacre that takes place. The European solution, the Europeans intervene, they send an army to Syria, to what is today Lebanon and Syria. The Ottomans send an army as well. And the Europeans insist that henceforth in Lebanon, in what Mount Lebanon, direct Ottoman rule over its subjects cannot continue. What there has to be is a sectarian administration. So the first sectarian administration that becomes the precursor to today's Lebanese state was set up in Mount Lebanon in 1861, when the Europeans decided that Ottomans could not directly rule their own subjects, their own Christian subjects. They had to be mediated by European controls. And so they created the sectarian system where they divided up Mount Lebanon into, the administration of Mount Lebanon into various sort of communities. And they said that the administrative council, the ruling body of this province, will include 2 members from each major community. So they divided up, so Maronites get this, Greek Orthodox get this, Greek Catholics get this, Sunni Muslims get this, Druze get this, and so on and so forth. And so they adopted a formal sectarian principle, and the idea was that is the way, and that is the only way to rule a multi-religious landscape equitably. You divide it up formally, which is exactly what the US will do ostensibly in Iraq after 2003. Now, note that neither the US nor Britain nor France use the same idea for themselves. They don't divide France or Britain or the United States along formal racial lines, for instance, even though the United States, of course, witnessed a massive civil war and massacres and race riots that put the Damascus massacre, not that one should ever compare killings or massacres, but it's not like this is the only part of the world where you've had inequality and violence against others. But in the Middle East, the Europeans decided, beginning in the 19th century, that some parts of the Middle East have to have sectarian administration. Of course, the problem with that, the Europeans say, look, this is the only thing these people understand. For them, religion is racial, in a sense. They can't be secular, which is a huge assumption. And they need to be divided up along sectarian lines. And of course, the effect of that is to reinforce sectarian identities, because if you don't belong to one of these communities, you can't actually participate in government. You can only participate in government if you belong to these communities, so it becomes this endless loop that reinforces this idea of sectarian identities, at the same time as it undercuts any possibility of secular identification. So the equivalent in the US for my students in Texas, I always tell them it's as if a foreign power comes into Texas after a race riot in Texas, and a foreign power abolishes the United States or the secular principles of the United States and says, henceforth, all government administration will be divided strictly and openly and formally along Latino, Anglo, and African American lines. What would happen in this country? What would happen to a notion of Texan or Republican or small r or American identity? It would come under tremendous threat. So that's what the Europeans did. Their idea, again, is that people in the Middle East cannot be secular. People in the Middle East are only sectarian, and they reinforce this in government. The Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, which, as I said, was reforming itself, trying to secularize, trying to centralize power, well, the Ottomans obviously resisted this. And they understood perfectly well that these forms of sectarian local government, these sectarian quota systems, were premised on the idea of almost perpetual European intervention in the affairs of the Ottoman state, because the Europeans were the guarantors of this system. The Europeans are the ones who decided who was to be the Ottoman governor over these various sectarian communities. And so the Ottomans resisted this. And rather than a sectarian system of government, the Ottomans adopted a nationalist principle. And the Ottoman mantra in the 19th century, with the exception of places like Lebanon, was that everyone should be Ottoman and that we will not discriminate formally on the basis of religious affiliation, especially after the Ottomans adopted the constitution in 1876. The problem, I know this is getting complicated, but bear with me for a minute. The problem is that the Ottomans, like every nation state or like every major nation state in the 19th century, decided that some people belonged to this nation and others suddenly became enemies. So what happens in the 19th century after 1860, and I make a very long story short, is that in the northern part of the Ottoman Empire, in the Balkans, what is today Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, these places, these regions split off from the Ottoman Empire with European assistance. They created new nation states, as I said, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, all of which assumed that the citizens of these states were to be Greeks, Bulgarians, and so on, which assumed further that these would be Christians, and that Muslims don't belong. And so what you see in the 19th century, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and especially after the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, is a massive displacement of populations. As Muslims are expelled from the Balkans into the Ottoman Empire, what's left of the Ottoman Empire, and in turn, Christians, at least those Christians who lived in the northern part of the empire, in other words, in Anatolia, and what was left here, and the Aegean, right here, and Anatolia here, those Christians who were left in the Ottoman Empire, in that part of the Ottoman Empire, were exposed to huge pressures of Ottoman nationalism, which then basically, by the late 19th century, decided, irrespective of the constitution that declared equality, it basically pushed those Christians out or made them unwelcome, which is the reason why the Armenian massacres, the great Armenian massacres, or massacres of Armenian subjects, occurs in the 1890s in the Ottoman Empire. And that's the reason why the Armenian genocide took place in the First World War. It's because the Balkan Christian states were developing and making their Muslim inhabitants unwelcome. In response, the Ottoman Turkish state responds by creating an Ottoman Turkish national identity, which was assumed to be a Muslim identity. Now, these are not religious, these are not ancient, these are very modern quarrels about creating nation states. The Armenians are the great victims in the Ottoman case. The Muslim subjects are the great victims in the Balkan situation. And what's interesting for the Arab perspective is that while all this is happening in the northern part of the empire, in the southern part, down here, in the Levant, here, this area, what is today Lebanon, what is today Palestine, Israel, what is today Syria, Egypt, this region experienced no ethnic cleansing, no nationalism to speak of in the Ottoman period. Christians were not persecuted, nor were Jews persecuted. So there's a bifurcation of the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. And what's, like I said, what's most interesting is that here you have a national question, which sort of Christians are being expelled from here to here, and Muslims are being expelled from here to here. And this culminates, of course, as I said, in the Armenian Genocide of 1915, where the Ottoman state basically goes after subjects who had been in the Ottoman Empire for centuries. And it's in this moment that they decide these Armenian, who of course are Christians, are not only not welcome, they have to be eliminated. And this happens during the First World War. But Arab Christians are not eliminated. In fact, the opposite. Between 1860, so the end of the Damascus massacre, and World War I, there is this period that Arab scholars refer to, and scholars who work in the Middle East refer to as the Nahda, in other words, the Renaissance. It's a period of extraordinary cultural, educational, literary renaissance. It's a period where Muslims and Christians and Jews, Arabic-speaking Muslims, Christians, and Jews, in this part, the southern part of the Ottoman Empire, began to elaborate what I would call an ecumenical identity. They began to elaborate notions of being Arab in a modern sense, of being equal and being Arab and being religious. There was no contradiction for most of these people between being religious and being Arab and being a subject, a loyal subject of the Ottoman Empire. There was no existential question here. There was no politics, as in no major separatist nationalism. European imperialism here was a very different kind than in here, in the Balkans, or in Anatolia. And so what you see is the irony of genocide in the north and coexistence in the south. In the Arab provinces, coexistence, a culture and a history of coexistence that I go into in a lot of detail in the book. I want to spare you the details today. And here you have a culture of nationalism and ethnic cleansing. And of course, I'm simplifying greatly, but I'm trying to give you the contrast between what's happening in the 19th century. So despite the obsession that we have today with sectarianism in the Levant and this monstrous thing called ISIS, the irony is that the Levant was in fact the one part of the Ottoman Empire where Muslim and Christian coexistence flourished most deeply, most interestingly, with most complexity in the 19th century, all the way through the First World War. So what happens then? Because that's when the story changes. Well, what happens is the map is redrawn, the Ottoman Empire is destroyed, and European imperialism goes from being a factor to being the main architect. But before I get into what happens after the First World War, let me just again emphasize a point to anticipate questions that may come. I'm not saying that equality was an easy thing in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. I'm not saying coexistence was an easy thing or a simple thing. I'm not saying that everyone agreed, because just like the US, just like Europe, just like India, just like every society, there were, as there remain until today, massive differences between different individuals belonging to different communities. Not because one is Muslim and one is Christian, but because one Muslim may be secular, another Muslim may be a pietist. One Christian may be secular, another Christian may be a pietist. One Jewish subject may be secular, another may be a pietist, whatever. So in other words, different people have different ways of engaging with the question of what does it mean to be secular, what does it mean to be modern, where is the boundary between religion and politics? And different people had different ideas. And my point is that in the Arab world, you had as much complexity as any other part of the world. The difference is that in this part of the world, you did not have, as I said, ethnic cleansing, any kind of major sectarian crisis between 1860 and the First World War. So in the final section of my talk, I'd like to discuss briefly with you how Western powers in the 20th century have both pursued sectarianism as a basic strategy, as a fundament of colonial rule in this part of the world, and at the same time, paradoxically and ironically, the very presence of European powers pursuing these strategies of divide and rule along religious or sectarian bases provoked in the Arab Levant in particular an imagination of anti-sectarianism as a key element of oppositional, anti-colonial imagination in the Arab world. So what I mean to say is that so long as the Ottomans ruled this part of the world and provided the Arab subjects in this part of the world with a sort of shelter under which they could explore in many different ways what it meant to be modern, what it meant to be secular, what it meant to be religious, what coexistence means, and so on and so forth. Once the Ottomans were removed and the Europeans came in, the Europeans did, and I showed this to you already, the Europeans split up the region because of Sykes-Picot and the Treaty of San Remo into various states. The first thing you notice about the map, of course, is the borders. And the other thing that you notice about these borders is that it's not the Arabs or the inhabitants who drew these borders, it's the Europeans who drew these borders, which were formalized and consecrated in the 1920s, following the conference at San Remo, where Britain and France basically divvied up these formerly unified provinces or formerly unified region of the Ottoman Empire into various states. And what's interesting is that the French create Lebanon right here as a Maronite-dominated, Christian Maronite-dominated state. It's not a Christian state, but it's a state in which their proxy, or at least the elites, some elites of the Maronites, in allegiance with the French or in alliance with the French, create this state carved out from Syria. And the French rationale, again, was exactly as it had been in 1860-61, which is to say, Muslims and Christians don't belong together. You need to separate them out. And so Lebanon is created as a state, a separate state. Syria is created as a state, and Syria is further divided by the French into an Alawi state, a Druze state, and an Arab state of Damascus and Aleppo. It's very interesting what the French do, and the logic is extraordinary given the history of France. So Protestant and Catholic, Huguenot and Catholic, doesn't matter. You have a French republic and a secular republic. Jews in France and anti-Semitism in France, doesn't matter. Everyone can be French and secular, allegedly, ostensibly. But in Syria and in the Arab, the logic is entirely opposite. The logic is divide and rule. And that is, I think, a basic reality. The British, of course, legitimate Zionism in Palestine. And Zionism is all about creating a Jewish state in Palestine. So again, there's a sectarian dimension to this as well. And so what happens, and that's why, incidentally, the term Arab and Jew, which in the 19th century Ottoman context had never been thought of, at least as far as I'm aware of, as antonyms, as separate, as oppositional, become oppositional in the 20th century under the auspices of British colonialism in Palestine. The first major Arab-Jewish riots, or anti-Jewish riots that take place in Palestine, take place in 1920 in the context of Zionism, the Balfour Declaration, and the British will to create or to enable a Zionist project in Palestine. I don't think there's any, I'm happy to debate or answer questions about this, but I think this is a fundamental reality that we have to think about, because it tears at the very idea of what it means to be Arab when you start separating people out on the basis of their religiosity. So if you say an Arab Jew is an impossibility, then you do violence both to the Arabs and, of course, to the Jews, because you deny what should be an essential aspect of an ecumenical culture. If you remove the Jews, you're doing violence not just to the Jews, but also to the Muslims and the Christians. And there's a certain logic to Zionism that takes place, and the reactions to Zionism in the Arab world. And so what happens is that eventually, by 1948, not only is Palestine destroyed in the Nakba, not to be confused with the Nahda, but the Nakba, in 1948, and Muslims and Christians are expelled en masse from Palestine, and this place is destroyed and transformed into, or turned into, a new state called Israel, which defines itself, as I said, as a Jewish state. But then in reaction to that, historic Jewish communities in the Arab world, in places like Baghdad, which had been there for centuries, become untenable. And so, as I said, you have this double tragedy. I'm not saying these are equal, I'm not saying they're the same, I'm saying we should think of them as one coherent problem, one problem with multiple dimensions. The end of the Palestinians, in terms of a Palestinian Arab society in 1948, because of the creation of a Jewish state, goes hand in hand with the end of Jewish communities in the Arab world. It's a double tragedy that has multiple ramifications. So don't think of it as, this or that. Both are happening at the same time. And it's one of the great tragedies of the Arab world, and the tragedies of sectarian and nationalist thought which cannot accept the idea of an Arab Jew or a Jewish Arab. This is one of the issues. The Western imperialism, however, of course, was not monolithic. I'd like to end with this point because, as I said earlier, one of the main sort of aspects of the post-Ottoman 20th century Arab world is not only the division of the Arab world into the various states and the Western policy of consistently splintering as much as possible, which is what all powers do, people to divide and rule, but also, as I said, there was an oppositional discourse, an anti-colonial idea that becomes manifest in the Arab world in the 20th century, and that is this idea of anti-sectarianism. In other words, to refuse to think of oneself only in sectarian terms, and in fact to do your utmost to not define yourself in sectarian terms, but in more cohesive national terms. Just like in the US, people resist and do not think of themselves in racial terms necessarily, they also think of themselves in national terms, precisely because everyone understands that there is a racial problem, there is a sectarian problem, and the way around that is to think beyond that and against the darker impulses of politics. And so one of the ironic effects of the British and French partition of this region is that it gives a huge boost, Palestine accepted. Even in Palestine there's a boost, but Palestine is destroyed. But in the rest of the Arab world, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Jordan, even in Egypt, which wasn't a mandate but was under British control, in all these countries you have a tremendous increase in anti-sectarian sentiment in the idea of trying to mobilize on the basis of being Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, Lebanese, and so on, irrespective of religious identities. It doesn't mean, of course, that that was the only form of mobilization or organization, but it does mean, if you think about it, that there's a reason why in the 1920s and 1930s across the Arab world, you had an extraordinary array of political and social movements. You had the creation of, in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, deeply conservative Islamist organization, yet it went out of its way to prove or to say that it included Coptic Christians as part of an Egyptian society. Of course, not exactly the same, so the Muslim Brotherhood said, but it made it a point of going out of its way to say that Coptic Christians are part of Egypt and the modern Egyptian state. You had the creation of communist movements, which of course were deeply secular and deeply anti-sectarian, formally almost. You had the creation of Arab nationalist parties, which were not communist, but were nationalist, but also made it a point of actually insisting that an Arab is first and foremost an Arab and not a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. You had radical Arab parties. You had all sorts of groups, religious and secular. And what's interesting about the Arab world of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, is that they didn't agree about the politics necessarily, secular or religious, but almost all accepted as a fundamental basis that in the Arab world, citizens would be equal irrespective of their religious affiliation. This became a norm in the 20th century. And that's, I think, the most important point that we've lost sight of completely today when we talk about the sectarian Middle East, as if people have always been sectarian, have always been divided. We've lost sight of the fact that for decades, beginning in the 19th century, in apolitical terms, turning into political terms in the 20th century, of a language and an imagination of anti-sectarianism. And that, I think, is one of the most interesting, most valuable, most important aspects of modern Arab history that I think we've lost sight of today because of the extraordinary transformations of the Arab world, especially in the last 2 and 3 decades. And so I'd like to end, if I could, with a reminder that not only is the problem of sectarianism, and I haven't even talked about Sunni and Shia in Iraq and so on, because it's so contemporary in terms of the problems that we're witnessing today. But I'd like to end with a question, or at least I'm wondering out loud: is there another way of telling the history of the modern Middle East without reverting to a narrative of a place that's doomed to endlessly repeat its allegedly sectarian past? I hope by now that you can see that I think that there is a way to narrate, which is to say the 19th century was, in the Arab context, especially the second half of the 19th century, post-1860, all the way through the mid-20th century, was a period, a century of what you could call a century of optimism. People believed that there was a possibility of building something greater than their communal or sectarian parts. Does this mean that this project has failed in our time? Yes, or at least it's come under tremendous stress. But simply because projects fail doesn't mean that they were artificial or they were wrong. It just means that there was a condition of forces that led to their failure. And the question is, how temporary is this failure? Or is it just a moment, a blip that we're in now, a really deep, dark, depressing blip that we're in now that will eventually turn? I think what we do need to do to answer this question is to always remind ourselves time and again that what we're witnessing today is a product of recent circumstances. It's not the 19th century, it's not even the 20th century, it's the it's the early 21st century. We need to abandon the traditional metaphor once and for all of the Middle East as a sectarian volcano always on the verge of an eruption. There is nothing permanent about any sectarian identity. They are not waiting to emerge, like desert locusts, to ravage the Middle East periodically and inevitably. Rather, these sectarian identities, no matter how real people may feel them to be, are shaped, crafted, and recrafted constantly. So an Ottoman Empire that used to discriminate led to an Arab culture that made it a point of saying we do not discriminate. And people believe it in both instances. And where we are today is in a very different period. There are specific trajectories. I've tried to mention one, an ecumenical trajectory that was interrupted by European colonialism and reshaped, that creates new realities. Just as the Ottoman imperial Muslim supremacy gave way to something radically different in the 19th century, what I've talked about, the project of equal citizenship and complex national coexistence in the Arab world, so too has this 20th century project, as I said, faltered, I admit, badly in our time. But rather than dwell on the inevitability of failure, I think it makes much more sense to focus on the efforts that were made in the 20th century to build, as I said, a world greater than the sum of their communal parts. Religion has never necessarily or simplistically dictated a political or cultural belief in the post-Ottoman Arab world. Religion could either be used to bolster a xenophobic chauvinism, or it could also help to create a cohesive national culture. There's nothing essential about any religion, whether it's Islam or Christianity or Judaism for that matter. Sunni Arabs, to bring it to contemporary, to end on the contemporary note, Sunni Arabs are not and have never been one political voice across the region, nor were the so-called minorities. By the middle of the 20th century, in fact, as I pointed out, the idea of national fraternity was an increasingly widespread expression of a lived history and a choice that many Arab Christians, not all Arab Christians, but many Arab Christians, Copts, Jews, Druze, Alawis, Shi'i, and Sunni Muslims made against what they perceived in the mid-20th century to be an insidious problem, an internal disease of sectarianism. They chose unifying nationalism as opposed to sectarian belonging because they understood that they were living in a historic moment, that there was a crossroads, that just like people in the US have to make a choice whether they're white or American or how to think of themselves as belonging to an ethnicity and belonging to the greater collective, so too people in the Middle East have to make similar choices. For a Muslim, Christian, or Jewish Arab to identify politically with each other was no less important and no less complex than the idea of a Hindu and Muslim Indian, or a French Catholic and Protestant, or a German Christian and Jew, to say nothing of the American case, as I've said over and over again, of white Americans accepting black Americans as their compatriots. In the Arab Levant, subjected to European colonialism in the 20th century, individuals from all walks of life chose ecumenical belonging as a way of life when they might have chosen, and some did in fact choose, to live as cloistered minorities or as xenophobic fundamentalists. So at the very end, there is no end to the story of sectarianism in the modern Middle East, although, as I've tried to suggest this evening, there is a 19th century beginning. In this time of despair, and I admit I am sort of in despair right now, it seems more urgent than ever to insist upon an honest reckoning with the history of modern diversity in the Middle East without equivocation or denial. This does not have to be an exercise in self-flagellation. You don't have to say the Arabs don't have to come here and say, oh, look how terrible we've been, it's terrible, terrible, terrible. No, rather this exercise could be one in a revitalized humanism. That is to say, to identify and engage in dialogue with those different figures, past and present, belonging to different faiths but not necessarily different political traditions. It is to understand how these figures fought to free themselves from what the English radical poet William Blake once called the mind-forged manacles. And just as important, it is to recognize and be prepared to recognize the meaning and the implication of these moments or those moments in the past, in the present, and of course in the future, that will betray the persistence of these manacles. What is clear above all is that we need to underscore over and over again the profound instability, the contradictions, the paradoxes that make up the substance and drama of what history actually is. Not an inevitable path to anything, good or bad, but a series of contingent, constrained, and faithful choices, moments, and turning points that have created the world we live in, including the modern Arab world. Thank you.
Okay, we have some time for questions. Yes.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Yeah, my name is Mesa. So the question I have, I'm asking my question from engineering standpoint. I believe you divided the cause into internal factors and external factors, and later on you more highlighted the roles of foreign invasions and imperialism in the region. At some point you did mention that the conflict in what we call Palestine there is just something new dated back to 1920. But I believe it goes back to even back to 15th century when the conflict was basically between Muslims and Christians. Or what you mentioned, the conflict between Arabs and Jewish. So that's something that I'd like if you have any comment on that. And the other thing is, we say that history is a class for us to learn from and move forward. So you did mention a lot of kind of decision by French or British that they are actually the root cause of what we have today. But I didn't see, at least I didn't hear any part from the U.S. role in today's conflict in the Middle East.
U.S. role?
Yeah. So if we say that, okay, now we have the only democratic state in the Middle East somehow is Israel, at least in terms of within its own borders. Not all the bad actions who are Palestinians, but
Who are in their own borders, but that's...
yeah. So, but at least they are interrogating their own prime minister, what we don't see in the region. But then we have all other Arab states; they are all ruled by dictators, military dictators or religious dictators, and they are all U.S. allies. So.
Could we allow the speaker to respond to what you've said so far?
Read a question. Read a question. Answer question by question. Okay. There are a lot of questions there. The first question, the reason why I say the Arab-Israeli conflict is a modern conflict is because it is modern. It's a 20th century. If you can stretch it, say late 19th, but really it begins with the Balfour Declaration and the Mandate of Palestine. You could go back to the 15th century. Is that what your question was, the 15th century? And you could talk about conflicts, religious conflicts, or conflicts over holy sites. That's not the Arab-Israeli conflict. That has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict per se. So you're mixing apples and oranges. Not every conflict involving a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew is the same. And that's why historians emphasize context and history, precisely to differentiate between what may be one conflict, a religious conflict over holy sites or access to holy sites in one period, and what is clearly a completely different kind of conflict, settler colonialism, European nationalism, all these things that occur in the 19th and 20th century. So I think it's very important to distinguish between the two. As to the second question, the U.S. role, it's a whole other lecture. The U.S. role, here we have the two experts. Right here, we have Ambassador Jerigian and Professor Matasso. who could tell you a lot more about the U.S. role, the actual U.S. role. And we have, of course, Dr. Citino as well. These are all experts who could tell you honestly at great length the U.S. role. But it's been look. I don't want to say it could be terrible, but let me be diplomatic and say, as Alan and I have discussed many times, since the U.S. hegemony over this region, especially after 1967 until now, ask yourself what has happened to this region under U.S. hegemony. Look at Iraq. That doesn't mean the U.S. is responsible for everything in Iraq, as I've said, but it certainly means that the U.S. has played a major role in Iraq. So nobody can talk about Iraq and sectarianism in Iraq today without also talking about the U.S. I mean, they're like tied together. That's what I would say. But the U.S. role has been consistently, on Palestine, for instance, on the Arab-Israeli conflict, consistently pro-Israel, pro-Jewish state, and there are consequences to that role. There's a consequence. When you take that kind of position, it plays out in the Middle East. It consistently undermines secular Arab nationalism, which is not to say, I agree with you, of course, the Arab rulers in the 20th century, particularly in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and even more in the 80s and 90s, have, as you described, there has been despotism, there has been jail, there's been torture, there's been dissent, there's been an abandonment and a betrayal, in fact, of the ecumenical heritage that they inherited and that they were themselves a product of. That, I think, is also part of the story as well. But the idea is to talk about all these things honestly and at the same time specifically and historically.
Yes, sir.
So, my name is Abdullah from Baker Institute. So during this process of Western powers inventing this sectarianism, looking at the history, do we see any local groups or elites, opinion leaders, religious leaders reacting against this invention, this process?
Yeah.
How was the overview of this picture?
Where specifically? In the whole region, or?
No, the Levant.
Yes, of course. I mean, that's the point of, maybe it wasn't clear enough, but of course, are you asking, did people react to?
Reacting against invention of this sectarianism?
Yes, of course they did. People reacted. That's why, as I said, the anti-colonial movements, the nationalist movements, various what we call fundamentalist religious movements, have all reacted in very different ways to the idea that, for example, in the Levant, a Muslim and a Christian cannot coexist. Of course people have reacted against that in many different ways. And that's why you have some are secular, some are religious. And leaders in particular have reacted with extraordinary emphasis. Every single nationalist movement in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Jordan, in Egypt, every nationalist movement makes the same point that they are anti-sectarian, precisely to argue against the European claim that these people cannot A, rule themselves, B, cannot be secular. Of course, there's been a reaction.
Rudina?
Can you please tell us a little bit about the factors leading to the 1860 massacres in Mount Lebanon, Damascus?
Would you repeat the question, Christine?
Sure. Rena's question is, can I repeat or can I list the factors that led to the massacres of 1860 in Mount Lebanon or in Damascus?
Well,
Okay, so there's two sets. I didn't want to get into all these because it's so complicated, but I will. To answer Rodena very briefly, there were two sets of massacres that take place. One in Mount Lebanon, which is a rural area, which is today is not the coast of Lebanon, but the mountainous regions, where the primary communities are the Maronite Christians and the Druze, which is an offshoot. You can think of it as they're a minority community. They're an offshoot of Ismaili Islam. And these two communities, or the leaders of these communities, had historically, lived in. Take this in. They basically ruled over Mount Lebanon until the mid-19th century on what I would call a non-sectarian basis. In other words, it was feudal rule. The Ottomans in the mid-19th century begin to transform this feudal system, which was indirect, into direct rule. The Europeans are intervening. There are missionary movements involved. Muhammad Ali of Egypt, this is a very long history, but invades Syria in 1831, between 1831 and 1840. And so when the Ottomans are restored to their rule by the British in 1840, different Druze and different Christian elites and peasants, commoners, have different ideas about what restored Ottoman rule is going to be. Some people think it means liberation from feudalism. Other people think it means liberation from Muslim rule. Other people think, so there's a huge contest that takes place in Mount Lebanon between various Maronites and various Druze that culminates in 1860, to make a very long story short, in a series of peasant uprisings against feudal lords, so Christian against Christian, and at the same time Christian against Druze, a contest over land which the Christian Maronites lose. Some Christian Maronites lose, and they're massacred. And it's really complicated. This is my first book, so I can't summarize it. I cannot possibly summarize it coherently or cogently.
But you get the idea.
The idea is that it's about land, it's about reform, about different interpretations of Ottoman rule and so on. And the Europeans and the Ottomans and various local actors are all involved. So it's not a massacre it's not just an urban riot. It's not a pogrom in Mount Lebanon. It's a struggle that one side loses. Okay, Damascus in 1860 is completely different. Although it happens at the same time, it's an urban riot where, for all sorts of reasons that historians have still don't agree upon, but some historians say, well, there were economic reasons. Some Muslim weavers were put out of work by European dumping because of mid-19th century economic liberalization. They then, in the context of Ottoman reforms, which pledged, on the one hand, non-discrimination, and on the other hand, increased conscription of Muslims, effectively, and in the context of economic decline. In this context, some historians argue Muslims in Damascus scapegoated the Christians of Damascus. There's no question that it was a massacre, and there's no question that it's an urban riot, and there's no question that Christians were victimized and targeted. Yet, one has to also say that most Muslims, or many Muslims, we don't even have a proper history, honestly, in Arabic of this event, but many Muslims saved Christians. And so it's important to emphasize in these riots that just because Christians are the victims, it means something. It tells us that in the history of the Ottoman Empire there was discrimination. There were urban forms of discrimination that got out of hand in this moment. But the point is, it was an episodic moment. It was the exceptional moment, that not the general rule of the 19th century. And in fact, what happens after 1860 is, as I said, this culture of coexistence that flourishes afterwards. That's a very complicated answer, but it's very back there.
So you talked a lot about the drawbacks of sectarianism, or at least the drawbacks now. How would you respond to a case of a country like Lebanon that has so many different factions and sects, where that's a part of their national identity?
Well, hang on, a good question. What do I do the question is what to do in a country like Lebanon.
Yeah, is the situation now favorable from that sectarian perspective?
Yeah, but think about the sectarian. So you said something very interesting. You said that did I misunderstand you or mishear you? Being sectarian is part of a national identity?
Like a country that takes pride on being, having Shia, Sunni, Christians.
Pluralism.
Yes.
Diversity. Correct. But I think many countries take pride in their diversity. The question is, should you take this diversity and then say we need to institutionalize it formally? And this is why in Lebanon there was a massive debate in 1925 leading up to the Constitution of 1926 about whether Lebanon should be a secular republic like France or whether it should be a confessional system the way it turned out to be. And those who argued for the confessional sectarian system said, look, sectarian identities are real and primordial and ancient, and we should take pride in them, B, as you're saying, and B, we can't avoid them. So the best way to deal with them is to recognize them and put them in government, and that way diffuse them and ultimately transcend them by convincing everyone that nobody has anything to fear and we'll all become Lebanese. The minority faction said, and I think they were right, they said if you do that, you're going to entrench sectarian loyalties, you're going to make people think primarily whatever people think, you're going to force people to think along sectarian lines, and you're going to create this disease, this cancer of sectarianism in all public and political life, where everything ends up being a sectarian calculus. It's what's happening in Iraq after 2003. And so just because people are diverse or take pride in diversity doesn't mean you have to formalize sectarian politics. This country, I don't know if it takes pride in diversity, but certainly claims to take pride in diversity today, and yet you still believe in this idea, at least in theory, you believe in this idea of being whatever you belong to, whatever religion, ethnicity you belong to, you also believe in being American. And that is one of the core strengths, or at least used to be, of this country and its public school system. So I think diversity and sectarianism they don't have to be automatically linked.
We have one more question, sir.
I'm gonna move you into another realm, but it's about what you're talking about, which is President Erdogan of Turkey has recently kind of reasserted an idea about a kind of neo-Ottoman empire or relationship that would somehow solve some of the, quote, problems of the area. And I was wondering how you interpret that, what you think about that.
It's a fantasy of despotism. You don't go back in history, you go forward, and you go forward in history.
Yeah, the question is, for me, it seems a little odd, right?
Yeah,
that you would be.
He also built a 1,000-room palace.
Yeah.
He's building now the largest mosque, in Istanbul. It's extraordinary. It's larger than any Ottoman imperial mosque he's had built on the Asian side.
Ottoman size when built in several other places.
Yeah, no doubt. So,
with Turkey.
but I don't want. We're in the Baker Institute. I don't want to offend Turkish diplomats who may be here or so on.
And Turkey is building mosques.
Yeah.
Throughout the period, or throughout the area that was a part of that Ottoman Empire, but also just fringes of it, where there are Turkic languages being spoken in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, other places.
Mm-hmm.
And they're the primary contributors to these really large religious institutions that didn't exist, of course, under their former Soviet rule. And the movement seems to be a way of re-sectarianizing what are sort of secular.
We'll give you the last word.
But again, in your very question, you're talking about geopolitics.
Yeah.
So again, we're talking about the intersection between geopolitics and fantasies of despotism, and at the same time, the idea of manipulating people's religious or ethnic or sectarian belongings. And so it's not that people are sectarian, and that's why Erdogan is acting the way he is. I think it's the other way around.
All right, let's give Ussama a final. Thank you.